So thank you so much for coming on, Hannah. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do?
Absolutely. My name is Hannah Frankman. I am the community manager at Praxis, which is a professional development program for young people starting their careers. So I do a lot of coaching and advising. I do a lot of curriculum development work, and a lot of back-end work managing our really awesome community. So I'm a homeschool grad, college opt-out, which is how I ended up here. Yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Fantastic. So what's one thing you do every day that makes you more valuable?
That's such a good question. I ask questions. That's the one thing that I do that makes me more valuable. I think I have a lot of layers to my philosophy on this because asking questions is one of my very favorite things that I do. And it always has been. It's always just been this like innate thing that I've done. I've always been innately curious. And I think that was accentuated and also preserved by growing up homeschooled. So, my education was very curiosity driven. So I just got very in the habit of always asking questions, refining the way in which I asked questions to get the information that I wanted. My high school experience was basically just me asking lots of questions and then just following rabbit trails, based on what I was curious about. So it was never really an intentional process. It was just something that I did. But my philosophy has always been the whole world has something to teach you, like literally everyone. There is something interesting that you can glean from them that will make you a stronger and smarter and better person. And the secret to unlocking this vast wealth of knowledge that the world all around you holds is that you have to master asking the right questions, because those are the keys that unlock this information. So it was a philosophy that was roughly held for a very long time. I would ask people questions because I was curious to kind of start to discern, okay, what do you know that I don't know, but that's interesting to me? And as I became more intentional about it, it became a very intuitive process, in that like you can kind of feel when you're getting closer to interesting information. You're like, oh, I feel like there's something, like you're saying something, but I feel like underneath the lines, there's something else. And if I keep asking questions from different angles, eventually I'll hit it. And that's kind of how I started being intentional about asking questions. And I went from just kind of blatant curiosity driven, like, oh, I want to know this, so I'm going to ask a question. It became a little more intentional about like, I don't know exactly what I want to know, but I know there's something here. So I'm going to refine the art of asking questions that help me sort of determine what that thing is in the first place and then how to extract it. And that's kind of how I was asking questions coming out of high school into like what would have been my early college years, launching my career. And then recently I've become very intentional about asking questions professionally, which I think is probably the biggest weapon in my arsenal of like professional development, and probably the biggest thing that's gotten me where I am. And for somebody who loves asking questions, it actually took me like a really long time to properly harness it for my own professional development. Like when I started working full-time as a coach, obviously my question asking ability went through the roof because I was asking people questions all of the time. And that became my job. Like I had to get really good at asking really good questions. That's what I'm getting paid for. I guess I better, step up my game, right? And I was hosting workshops every week, sometimes multiple times a week for Praxis, where we'd bring in guest speakers and I'd interview them. So I got really good at asking questions to kind of pull out information from them. And so that kind of paired with my just innate curiosity about the world and my habit of just like, I'm curious about this. I'm going to frame it in my head as a question and then I'm going to go seek out the answer on Google or in books or whatever. Kind of drove my self-education that replaced what would have been my 4 years of college. But then more recently, I started to become much more intentional about asking very specific questions of the world around me and the people around me, like very focused questions that were less about, I know you know something that I don't know, and I'm just kind of trying to figure out what it is, and more focused around, I want to grow and change and evolve in this very specific way. And I know that you know how to do that. And I don't know how to do it yet because like you've already gone through this process and I haven't. So I'm going to ask you very directed, pointed questions about this specifically, like the way in which I want to develop. And then just kind of like let you run with it. And then more questions will become apparent once you start talking. And I've started, over time using the wealth of knowledge that is the people I've intentionally surrounded myself with, like the wealth of knowledge that they hold, asking really specific questions to unlock that. So, one of the assets that you start to develop as you build your life is you go to the places that are interesting and valuable to you. And you start to surround yourself with a very specific type of people. And they tend to be the types of people who are on the same path as you, at least partially. And so the information bank that you're curating, that you have the capacity to tap into, you ask the right questions, becomes much more specified and much more nuanced and valuable. So being more specific about your questions in that kind of context is just insanely valuable. So I've started tapping into that. And like I said, it took me a ridiculously long time to realize, I can start tapping into this and that's okay. And like I've built up a lot of social capital here and I can just ask a lot of questions and people actually don't mind because it's an investment in me too. Just being very intentional about that. And then on top of that, besides just being intentional about asking people questions, being intentional about asking questions of the world and framing the things that I'm thinking about in the context of questions. So for example, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot because I've been reading a couple books on the topic, like the shift in mindset from like technical person or employee or person who's like kind of shoehorned in one specific category and thinking more like an entrepreneur or a manager. And a lot of that comes in the form of asking really good questions. Like, we do this way. And it's kind of just like base level assumption that because we do it this way, we will keep doing it this way. And that's, I think, an assumption that a lot of us hold. Even I, coming out of like a homeschool background, very outside of the system, I had a lot of assumptions coming into the real world as like a 17, 18-year-old. Things are this way. And I'm stuck within those parameters and those rules. Like I have to adapt to, you either have to have a college degree, you have to have some kind of credential, you have to follow this path or this path. You can only proceed in life in this specific way. And it took me a long time to realize, this is always changing because you don't have perspective on how things change as a young person. Like things are always changing. And it's just like human beings who are driving this process. There's a great Steve Jobs quote where he says, everything in the world around you was just built by people like you. It's just other humans who imagined and built that. So starting to realize like, if you think more creatively, you can do whatever you want. And so then starting to engage the whole world as a question, like we do it this way, but what if we did it this way? Like what's the end result we're trying to create? And what if we did it a different way? And just getting in that habit of just questioning everything, not from the standpoint of like getting yourself all tied up in asking questions and never making progress, but just from the standpoint of, I want to learn how to think as nimbly and limberly and creatively as possible. And asking questions is the best way to unlock those possibilities that you don't normally think about. So that's kind of like the evolution of how and why I ask questions in a nutshell. I could go off on tangents about like every single piece of this, but I think this is pretty cohesive. But that's kind of, why I started asking questions in the first place and why they have been such an important asset to my growth and becoming more valuable, because literally every time I ask a question, I learn something new, and that new piece of information, I can integrate it with all of the other things that I already bring to the table. And it makes me just a little bit smarter and a little bit better. And all of those different pieces that I keep intaking, they all catalyze with each other and create new information and new possibilities. And it just kind of sets the path for this continued exponential, maybe a little dramatic, but continued in speedy growth as a professional and as a person.
Yeah. No, I think exponential probably would capture it in a way because, you're using questions to kind of unlock the base of knowledge that you've grown by using questions.
Exactly.
There you go. I am wondering, you're talking about how much you've learned asking different kinds of questions and the different types of questions you've gone through. For doing this every day? Is there like a thought process that you go through, like, oh, I need to make sure that I'm asking questions at a specific point to make, to keep growing each day? Or is it more like a habit at this point?
I know this answer isn't terribly helpful because it doesn't really like help anyone else get from point A to point B. And I can circle back to that in a second because I can kind of distill the process a little bit, but it's just habit. It's just the way that I think. Everything is a question to me. Yes, it is intentional in that like I've become more deliberate about making a point to ask questions about things, and especially like professionally in terms of like problem solving, getting better at asking just like a whole slew of questions every time I'm presented with a problem. Like, why do we do it this way? How else could we do it? What's the result that we're creating? What are the problems? What if we like scrap this entirely and like didn't even ever think about it again? That one would happen. So that part is intentional, but for the most part, it's just a habit. I'm just really, really curious.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. Like, you've been doing it for so long, like
yes.
Even going through your evolution sort of explains it. Just, that's who you are now. It's not even it's intentional, but it's not intentional.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for explaining that. Is there anywhere that people can find you, find out what you're doing?
Yes, there is. I'm fairly active on Twitter, which is where a lot of the like culmination of my questions tend to end up because I share like the little things that I'm thinking about. So I'm just Hannah Frankman on Twitter. Hannah Frankman on Instagram too, less intellectual platform to follow me on, but you get to see cool pictures of sunsets and beaches in Charleston. So if you like that, come follow me. And then my website, which is where that's kind of the central hub of everything that I do. And that's where I collect a lot of the more in-depth things that I'm working on. So that's just hannahfrankman.com. And I would love it if you came and checked me out there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily.
You're welcome.